disciplines that collaborate and intertwine. The one we spent most time on is motor development. We're going to spend just a couple of lectures looking at some basic principles for motor learning, and then the third element is motor control, that looks at how the brain initiates and controls action. All right, so we're going to look at some classification ideas, because if we want to look at how we learn skills, we need to be able to classify them into groups, because groups of skills have similar properties that would impact learning. All right, so we're going to talk about what motor learning is, and then we're going to look at a one-dimensional classification of skills, and then we'll go through the two-dimensional one that's on the handout that I gave you. And then if we have time, we'll take a look at the concept of motor abilities. All right. So people who research under motor learning are interested in what skills people are able to learn, how quickly they learn them. So as coaches, that's important, because if I'm trying to change a motor pattern that someone has, I want to have an idea of how quickly that might happen. And then really importantly, it doesn't matter what kind of learning, whether it's motor skill or academic or something to do with your job, how well do we retain skills that we learn? Or do we have to keep relearning them? Okay? So just to differentiate, skill is the actual task, the actual activity that we're giving someone to do. Could also be called action. It should have a specific goal to achieve. And skilled, to be skilled, is representative of how well I am performing the task. So, one-dimensional classifications have been around for a very long time. I learned them when I was in undergrad, and so they're historically often referenced in the literature, okay? And what we're looking at is trying to identify things about skills that are the same so that we can group them. And when we use a one-dimensional classification, then we use the idea of a continuum with the extremes on either end, okay? So we typically see three versions of one-dimensional classifications. The first one is looking at what kind of muscles are being used primarily to create the skill, make the skill happen. The second one is looking at where does the task start and where does it finish. And the third one is looking at the environment that the task is occurring in. So the first one has a continuum that runs from using big muscle groups called gross motor skills. You should recognize that term because that's what we've been talking about for most of the semester. All right? And then on the other end of the continuum, we've got skills that use very small muscle groups, and that end is called fine motor skills. Okay. So walking, hopping, jumping, throwing, catching, all the skills that we've been working on are considered gross motor skills. Things like writing a check, using a keyboard, playing a piano, doing up the buttons on your shirt, bless you, tying shoelaces. Those are considered fine motor skills. Reading is a fine motor skill, all right, because the muscles that move your eye so that you can track across the page are very small. The second version, where did the task start and where does it end? Okay, so, oh, let me go back 1 minute, sorry. On our extremes, we have some skills that are definitely just using small or big muscles. It's a continuum, remember, all right? So I can place a skill anywhere along the continuum. So some skills are a combination of large and small muscles. So if I'm going to perform archery, right, then I have to use the large muscles of my back to pull, but releasing the string and releasing the arrow is fine, right? So it would lie somewhere in between these two ends, depending upon which muscles I think are the most important to the skill, right? And what ratio do they both play within the performance of the task. So group 2, we have on one end skills that have an arbitrary beginning or an arbitrary end point, and they often involve repetitive movement pattern. So steering a car is considered a continuous skill. Our other end of our continuum, we're looking at skills that have a very defined beginning and end point, right? Usually they are one relatively simple movement, okay? So walking and swimming, of course I have to start walking, but the movement pattern is repeated. So the start is arbitrary because I do the same thing all the time to achieve the goal of going for a walk. Right? Hitting one piano key is a discrete movement because I just move one finger. If you drive a manual car, then using the clutch pedal is a discrete movement. Now, on this one-dimensional classification, they actually give a name to some skills that would fall kind of in the middle here. So we have a group that are called serial motor skills, and they are tasks where I have to link together several discrete skills in a sequence. So a gymnastics tumble run, right? If you watch gymnastics and the gymnast is at the corner of the floor and they do their insane tumble run across the floor, that's a serial skill because they're combining a round off and a back handspring and a somersault or more than one somersault, right? So they're doing a whole sequence of skills that could be performed on their own. Okay? So pressing one piano key is discrete, but playing a tune becomes serial. Does that make sense? Okay. And our third option for classification is involving where the skill is taking place. Right? So on one end of the extreme, we have what we call open motor skills because there is motion occurring within the environment. Right? So that motion could be related to the surface. It could be related to the fact that there is an object moving, or it could be related to the fact that there are other people within the environment who are moving. So typically, not in New Mexico often, but typically driving is an open motor skill because there are other cars on the road. Right? There might be people crossing backwards and forwards across the road. Catching a ball is considered an open skill because the ball has to be moving in order for me to catch it. Okay. On the other end of the continuum, we have closed motor skills. So these are skills that occur in an environment that is very stable, very predictable, right? The surface is stationary, the objects, if there are any, are stationary, and there probably aren't other players within the immediate vicinity. Okay. So picking up a cup of coffee is a closed motor skill. Throwing a ball is a closed motor skill because until you release the ball, there's no movement of the object, right? So catching has to be open because the ball has to be moving, but throwing is considered closed because until I release and I finish the throw, there's no movement in the environment. Does that make sense? Lots of long looks. Good? Okay. So, what this means then is that we can classify a skill 3 different ways. So when we pick a motor skill, it doesn't only get classified on one of these one-dimensional classifications, right? The same skill can be classified on all 3 of them. Okay? So, let's say we are watching a penalty kick. Right? So the first one, remember, is it gross or fine? So what do you think the penalty kick would be? Kicking? Kicking. Is it gross or fine? Gross. Gross, right? Is it continuous or discrete? Discrete. Discrete. Good. Is it open or closed? Closed. Relatively closed, right? Because when you're taking a penalty kick, the ball is stationary until you kick it. The other players are not allowed within a certain distance, They're not allowed to interfere, so they're out of the way. All right? So it would be relatively close. Okay? So any skill you can come up with, you can classify on these 3 one-dimensional continuums. All right? Okay, so two-dimensional. So there are some limitations to the one-dimensional. You know, particularly the more complicated the skill is, the more difficult it becomes to place the skill distinctly at either end of these one-dimensional classifications. And so they have some limitations where you have to go, oh, well, I suppose it's more continuous than it is discrete, or, okay? So, in about 2000, a researcher decided that she was going to try to develop another classification system that would overcome these limitations. And what she did was, she took some of the characteristics from the one-dimensional one and put them together into a two-dimensional version. All right? Now I have to say, although this is outside my area of research, so I could be just behind and out of date, there's a lot of research that uses the one-dimensional classification. There is less, unless you're looking at PE literature, there is less research out there, sadly, that uses the two-dimensional one because it's actually very useful. And we're going to use it for several different things. So the first thing she did to create her taxonomy was come up with 2 general factors about skills. Right? So she's trying to, remember, organize relationships among components of characteristics, factors, variables. So she picked something to do with the environment and something to do with the action itself. Very simple. Right? And then she subdivided those 2 first categories. The environmental aspect she divided into regulatory conditions and into trial variability. So the regulatory conditions are the characteristics of the environmental context that determine how the movement is produced. So it's very similar to our idea of our open-closed continuum. Right? So for her, she said that skills were either stationary, which would equate to closed, or they were in motion, which would relate to open. So the environment is either stationary, predictable, stable, or the environment is in motion, unpredictable, lots of movement going on. Okay?
So what about like running, like on track? Would that be closed or open?
It would depend what kind of running. If you were looking at a 10,000 meter race where everybody bunches together, that would be much more open. If you were looking at do they stagger a 200 meter?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're looking at a 200 meter race, it's more stationary because they have to remain in their lane the whole time, and so you don't have anybody interfering with you. The other environmental variable she wanted to look at was what's going on attempt to attempt to attempt, right? So each time I try it, what is happening in the environment? So she picked that variability was absent, so the environment was the same every time you do the skill. So if I am doing a cartwheel on the beam, a beam is a beam is a beam. The only thing that can change is it higher or lower? So it's relatively, intertrial variability is pretty absent because the environment is pretty much the same every time I do the cartwheel, right? Or intertrial variability is present, which means every time I do the skill, the environment is different. So teeing off during a golf match, every time I tee off from a different tee. So the environment is different, right? The other initial category that she came up with was looking at what's going on with the actual task, right, with the skill. And so here she's looking at the person doing the skill, and she picked body orientation. So my body is stable, I'm not moving. Or there's body transport, which could be active or passive. So for example, a skateboard, I'm not really moving per se, but my body is being transported from point A to point B. Okay. And her other choice was object manipulation. Very simple, is there an object, is there not an object? So when we combine all these ideas, we get a matrix with 16 skill categories, right? 16 boxes, which is the handout I gave you. So, this looks a little overwhelming when you just pick it up and look at it, right? It's like, well, how on earth do I classify a skill with all these boxes and choices? It's actually very simple if we cheat a little bit, all right? So what we're going to do is we are going to ignore what is going on in the environment initially. And we're just going to concentrate on the function of the action, which is along the top of the grid, okay? So, by using very simple yes-no questions, I can cut this great big box down to something more manageable. So my first question is the body moving? Or is the body stationary? So that's really easy. If I'm watching a skill, I can easily say yes or no on whether or not the person is moving, right? So by answering one yes-no question, I cut my matrix in half. So now we're down to 8 boxes instead of 16 boxes. Right? Next yes-no question. Stick with the function of the action. Is there an object or is there no object? Right? Yes or no? Again, very easy to answer. Right? Is there a ball? Is there a bat? Is there a ribbon? Right? Is there anything that they're manipulating? Yes or no? By answering yes or no, I now cut my chart into 4 boxes instead of 16. Right? Now comes the slightly trickier bit, because now I've got to tackle the environmental context that the skill is being performed in. And it's a little bit trickier sometimes to make a clean decision here. So, the first thing I'm going to concentrate on is whether or not the stationary conditions are stable, right? Whether the environment is stable and there would be no variability. Okay? Or is the environment got motion in it and there's variability every time I tackle the skill? Okay? Then I have to decide about, then I've got to combine those two ideas. So line one is there are stationary regulatory conditions. So my environment is relatively closed and there's no intertrial variability. Okay? Row 2, box 2, is the environment is relatively closed, but in my opinion, the environment can change trial to trial. Okay? So, I don't know if this is the same in American football. In rugby, when you kick a penalty, the penalty has to be kicked from the line of action where the foul occurred. Thank you. Right? So the penalty, if I've got my uprights, right, I could be over here in version to my uprights, I could be over here in line to my uprights, I could be a long way away, I might be quite close, I could be anywhere. So, but no one's allowed near me. So it's stationary because no one's allowed near me and the ball is still on the floor, but there's intertrial variability because I may not kick 2 penalties in a row from the same place. Okay? I don't know how that relates to American football, and in soccer it's...
American football's always from the middle.
From the middle.
Rugby, it's like if they get a try in rugby and you put it down wide, you take the kick wide.
Kick wide, yeah.
But it's not like that in football.
No, okay. Alright, so there are circumstances where the environment may be stationary, but there are differences in the environment trial to trial. Okay? Box 3 is the environment is unstable, it's in motion, there's something moving, but it's the same every time. Okay? And then the last box is there's movement in the environment and every time I try it it's different. Okay? So it's actually not too complicated to place your skill in one box. Right? So that might, if you then go back to the literature, give you some really good ideas on how you should teach that skill. Another way you can use the matrix is as a developmental plan for a skill. So if you look at the descriptions in the boxes, the top left-hand corner is very easy and the bottom right-hand corner is very complicated. So once I've placed my skill, I can progress that skill by moving it down and to the right. Right? If I can come up with versions that match boxes down and to the right, I can make it more and more complicated as the individual gets better and better at the skill. So I can use it to create developmentally appropriate progressions, or I can use it to identify a skill so that I know the best way to teach it. Okay? We don't have time to go into the best way to teach different skills. That's a 411. If anybody's interested, every time I try to run 411, no one signs up for it and then gets cancelled. But we would be developing the idea of how do I teach different types of skills, right? Based on how do we learn them. Okay. There is an article up to help you review this idea of using these continuums. It's very easy to read. It's another JOPAD one, teacher practitioner based, so it's not difficult to read and complete. And what I would like to do, if we have time on Wednesday, is to practice that two-dimensional classification a little bit. All right? We'll see if we have time. Question? Okay. All right. So we're going to talk then a little bit about motor abilities, and this is often a little controversial because it sometimes goes against what we have been taught to believe about our effort and trying hard and things like that. So motor abilities then are genetically inherited traits that I have more or less of. And when we're looking at motor abilities, we're looking at the traits that underline movement skills. But there are different kinds of abilities for all different sorts of learning. Right? So it's important to recognize that this is an inherited trait, okay? And so what it provides is the potential that an individual has for learning a particular type of skill. So when we're teaching, we can use the idea of abilities as a way of making our teaching practice, our cues, very individual, because everybody's got different levels of these abilities. Okay? So they act as the achievement potential. They set the limit on proficiency that we can achieve. Okay? So historically, a long time ago, long time ago, it was felt that there was one general motor ability. Okay? That if someone was good at games, they were good at sport, they were good at all sport. Okay? And so people felt that that meant that there was just this one motor ability, and people either had it in spades or didn't have it in spades. But what we know is that that wasn't quite right, right? That we actually have many, many different motor abilities, and we have different levels of each one, and they combine to give us our kind of potential for different movement skills. Right? So now we have the idea of specificity of motor abilities. Which motor ability is the most important to be successful at a particular type of skill? Right? Do I have it or do I not have it? Okay. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the idea of an all-around athlete. So we even have world championships and Olympics, specifically for an all-around athlete, right? We have decathlon. This is someone who has lots of motor abilities and they're pretty good at lots of different things. But if you actually look, so in decathlon they have to run 100 meters. Right? The time that the person who wins the decathlon gold medal gets in his 100 meters would not get him into the 100-meter semi-final, let alone the 100-meter final. Right? So he's really good at lots of things, but he's not great at one thing, like a sprinter. Right? So he has a big mix of motor abilities that allow him to be very good at throwing, jumping, running, but not brilliant at throwing, jumping, and running. Just good, better than average, right? So it's been a long time since the initial work on motor abilities was done. It hasn't really ever been completed. People got interested in other things, and it hasn't ever got totally finished. So originally, bless you, originally Fleischmann came up with two categories. He put skills under perceptual motor abilities or under physical proficiency abilities. It wasn't a complete list. He didn't look at balance. And we have static and dynamic balance. We know they're not the same. And there's often arguments about whether balance is an ability or a skill. Is it something I can learn? If I can learn it, it's a skill. If I have balance or I don't have balance, it's an ability. Right? So I can improve my balance if I have balance by practicing. It's not the same as learning balance in the first place, right? So there's quite often arguments about that. Visual acuity and tracking is considered an ability now that Fleischmann did not include in his lists. So under his perceptual motor abilities, he had 11 options, right? So something like reaction time. We often hear people say, oh, well, you know, I trained so hard I improved my reaction time. No, you can't improve reaction time, it's genetic, right? You can improve response time, but that's not the same thing, okay? And we'll have a quick look at that on Wednesday. Arm-hand steadiness, okay? Well, I would hope that someone that is training to be a brain surgeon has really good arm-hand steadiness. Me, I don't. If I try to put mascara on without hanging onto my arm and having my elbow on a table or a shelf, my mascara ends up all over my face, right? I have no arm-hand steadiness. Okay? Wrist-finger speed. So people who can type 90, 120 words per minute have a lot of wrist-finger speed. Me? Right? Not happening. Okay? Group 2 was the physical proficiency abilities. Okay? So, different versions of strength are based on your genetics. Right? So, do I have the kind of strength that allows me to run a marathon quite quickly, or do I have the kind of strength that allows me to throw a shot put a long way? Because they're not the same. Different types of flexibility. It's not that I can't improve my flexibility, but I can only improve it within what I was given. Right? I can't take someone who's really, really tight and stiff and turn them into a bending toy. Not going to happen. I can't take someone who is slow and make them fast. Not going to happen. Right? Because they're genetically slow. Can I find something that being slow is useful for? Right? Because they're not going to be a sprinter. Okay? So the idea when we're looking at motor abilities is that we all have all of those abilities in some degree or other. Right? Some of us have all of them in very small amounts. Some of us have all of them in very large amounts. Most of us have about middling, average amounts, right? Makes us average level movers. You guys, because you're so good at what you do, clearly have more of the motor abilities that make you good at your particular event, right? If we have these abilities, then we can measure them, right? And if I can measure them, then I can start predicting who's going to be good at a certain thing, right? And I can evaluate. I can use them for evaluating someone's performance. So the prediction idea is used a lot in the military, right? Training a fighter pilot costs thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So you don't just get to apply to be a fighter pilot because that's what you've always wanted all your life. If you want to be a fighter pilot, they are going to put you through a battery of tests to find out whether you have the right motor abilities to make it worth spending thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on you. And if you don't, guess what? Sorry, mate, you don't get to be a fighter pilot, go do something else. Right? It's tough. But that's the reality of it. Right? Okay. Medical school, depending what level of surgery you want to do, will weed you out based on motor abilities. Right? Certain industries will run motor ability tests because if you are working on a conveyor belt and the thing you have to do has to happen very fast and your reaction times are very slow, they're not going to put you on that part of the conveyor belt because that slows down production. So it applies to all kinds of things, not just sport and exercise. So how can we apply this idea? Right? If I can ID these motor abilities, if I can identify them, if I can measure them, then as the teacher, if I'm watching someone struggle with a skill that I think I have presented very developmentally appropriately, and I've given them lots of opportunity to pick this skill up, and they're still struggling. Why are they still struggling? This might be one of the reasons. Motor abilities would come under structural, functional, depending which ability you're looking at, constraints. They're an individual constraint. So is there an individual constraint that is holding this person back from learning the skill which I believe I have presented very appropriately? Okay? That can help me develop further lesson plans to try to improve that motor ability. Right? It's a little bit like the task analysis idea. What were the constraints that played a role in being successful? What are the things I can do to train that constraint? So it's a similar idea. Means we have to be very specific in our evaluation. So the assessments that we use have to be very specific to what it is I'm trying to find out. So, for example, I take a skill, I can break it down into what I have to do in order to do the skill, right? So I can do a skill analysis, right? So I've got to toss the ball, I've got to swing the racket, I've got to make contact, and I've got to follow through. So grip would be important, because if my tennis racket goes flying out of my hand as I swing my arm back, I'm not going to be very good at a tennis serve. Right? Can I toss the ball consistently with my non-dominant hand? Right? So then I can start to think about, well, what are the motor abilities that would help me with these parts of the skill that I've identified. Okay. So grip would be static strength, because I've got to hold that racket solid the whole time. But the swing and the strike would be dynamic strength, because I've got to be able to move and not keeping my arm still. I've got to have multi-limb coordination, because both arms are doing different things. My arms are doing something different to my legs. Right? So if I identify the abilities, then can I come up with some little games that would work on that ability? Does that make sense? Okay. Oops. Wait. Why don't you throw stuff at me, guys?
Give us attention.
You know, once I'm babbling away, you have to throw things at me, shut me up.